the Anglo-Saxon kingdom in which Wulfstan was working as bishop was in its last decades at the time he made his sermon, right? Of course, he died before 1066, but how does that kind of make us look back at this period differently? How much of his England survived into the, what became English history later?
Yeah, it casts an interesting kind of shadow back over his time, I suppose, that we know, the Anglo-Saxon state wasn't going to last much longer. But actually quite a lot of, particularly the sort of legal culture that Wulfstan and his contemporaries and the people that he worked with kind of created, did actually survive the Norman conquest. It was one of the things that survived because the Norman kings were aware that Canute had been a previous conqueror of England, and not that long ago, it was only kind of just out of living memory. And so they actually did follow that precedent of trying to make law a sort of unifying force. And they kind of ostentatiously followed the law of Canute and sort of said, we're going to follow Canute's laws, which was Wulfstan's law. And so aspects of that law kind of continued after the conquest. So of all the many things about Anglo-Saxon England that died as a result of the Norman conquest, actually Wulfstan's legacy and his preaching and his laws kind of didn't. They did survive, which is sort of nice. It wasn't the end of his world in that sense.
That's amazing.
Can you talk about what the kind of character of that law was? Like, in what way would it have been different from the law that prevailed among the Vikings in their homeland, or that they would have preferred?
I suppose the difference to a Viking law was that it was, absolutely Christian. So that, the observation of things that we would consider to be more like kind of private, I guess, or sort of church-oriented Christian practices were part of national law. So things like the observance of feast days, paying tithes to the church on particular days, observance of fasting, what support for the church and priests and monasteries and so on like that is kind of written into the law itself. So we started off talking about the importance of feast days, and the very fact that you can kind of lay down, like Wulfstan does in this law, like this is the day on which everyone will be fasting. We're all going to keep 18th of March as the feast of St. Edward or something. Obviously Viking law didn't observe Christian feasts. So that aspect of kind of trying to associate that with the other aspects of law, like punishment for theft or whatever it might be, suggests that all of those kinds of things are integrated. And for Wulfstan, that's really important, I think, that sense that like church law is kind of not optional. It's not a private matter. It's something that's a matter for all of society.
Is there, obviously our kind of like stereotype of what this kind of thing would have been about was bringing of something like what we might think of as Christian gentleness into Viking culture. Is there any truth to that in from a legal perspective?
Yeah, in one sense, in that a lot of it is kind of about trying to prevent people taking the law into their own hands, I suppose. So trying to prevent, say, the feuds that are quite common in pre-Christian Viking culture, where essentially punishment for a crime is up to the family of the victim, and they are entitled to kind of take the punishment as ever they want. So part of these sorts of law codes is about almost like taking that personal element out of it, saying it's, if a wrong is done to a member of your family, you're not failing in your duty to your family if you agree to, say, like for money to be paid rather than for violent revenge to be taken. So that's part of it. I think it's, it's kind of trying to give a more Christian structure to things like settling disputes and wrongs, rather than just allowing people to kind of do it as seem best to them.